Everybody, and welcome to today's event, which is focusing on mental wellness and resilience for the climate crisis. My name is Fiona Garvin. I'm the Director of Scottish Community Development Centre, and we're running today's event in partnership with Scottish Communities for Climate Action Network and Scottish Community Alliance. And we've got colleagues from all of our organisations joining us here today. I'm chairing today's event, but in the hopefully very unlikely event of an internet failure, Angus Hardy from Scottish Community Alliance will step in as chair, but we're hoping that connections will remain okay, especially for Bob from Oregon. So I'm delighted that we've got Bob here with us today, Bob Doppelt. He's here to talk to us about his research and practice in wellbeing and resilience for climate trauma. Now, the reason this event has come about is as a result of Bob's approach to engage practitioners and policymakers at an international level in discussions about how we act locally and globally to mitigate climate-related trauma. I had the good fortune to be contacted by Bob earlier this year and to hear and learn about his work with the International Transformational Resilience Coalition. And it occurred to me when I was reading his research that we've not yet had any meaningful discussions on this topic in Scotland, at least not in the community-led sector, and not to my knowledge anyway. I think we've got many initiatives and policy directives on climate action, but less so on initiatives to deal with the psychosocial effects of the climate crisis and how those might affect how we configure health and other services now and in the future. So the purpose of this event is to touch on the topic and to try and kickstart those discussions. But before I introduce Bob properly, I'm going to talk you through the programme for the session and quickly go over a few virtual housekeeping points. So the programme goes that first of all, we're going to hear from Bob. He's going to go through a presentation based on his work. We'll then have a quick Q&A session, and after that, we're going to break into smaller discussion groups, and you'll be assigned a breakout room. You don't need to do anything, you'll just be assigned a breakout room. When you get into your breakout room, your facilitator will identify themselves, and then they'll suggest that you take a 5 to 10 minute break, because by that time it'll be nearly 5 o'clock. The discussions will last around about 30 minutes, after which we'll all come back into the main plenary session. And in the plenary session, what we'd like to do is hear one key point raised from each of the discussion groups. And we're also going to hear from 3 keynote listeners very briefly who we've got teed up to respond to the discussion here today. And just to reassure everyone, our intention is that we will finish no later than 6 o'clock tonight, or I think 10 o'clock in the morning, wherever Bob is. So before I hand over to Bob and introduce him formally, I think we might be running a couple of polls, or have we got them ready, Joanna? If we don't, we'll just move right on. No, right, okay. We were going to run a couple of polls just to find out what different sectors we're from, but basically I think that might come up in some of the discussions that we have. So I'll just come back in and introduce Bob formally. Bob founded and coordinates the International Transformational Resilience Coalition, the ITRC, which is a network of mental health, human services, climate, education, faith and other organisations committed to building universal mental wellness and resilience to prevent and heal climate change-generated mental health and psychosocial problems. Bob is trained in both counselling, psychology and environmental science. He's also a meditation instructor at Spirit Rock in California and a mindfulness-based stress reduction instructor. For almost a decade, he's directed the Climate Leadership Initiative, a research and technical assistance programme at the University of Oregon, which led him to then go on and organise the ITRC. So, Bob, can I hand over to you now, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Fiona, and thank you all of you for inviting me here today. I would like to share my screen if I still have that capability. And great. Okay. My name is Bob Doppelt, and I coordinate the ITRC, the International Transformational Resilience Coalition. Just a very brief background. My organization, I used to, as Fiona just said, used to direct the Climate Leadership Initiative. We were a research and technical assistance program at the University of Oregon, but we were one of the very first organizations in the US funded by foundations and others to help local and state governments and others develop their first climate action plans. So as an example, 10 years ago, we went to Florida, even though we're located in Oregon in the US, and organized the Southeast Florida Climate Resiliency Compact that brought together Miami and Dade and Broward County. It's the largest metro areas in Florida to prepare for the impacts of climate change, sea level rise, storm surges, et cetera. But Superstorm Sandy came along. You might remember that 10 years ago or so. And we saw mental health and psychosocial problems skyrocket in the northeast of the US, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, but they also were shown in Florida because the hurricane went up the coast of Florida. And that's what made me realize we need to engage in these issues in the mental health and psychosocial aspects of the climate emergency, because my background in climate science made it very clear this was going to get far worse. So one thing, just a starting point, I want to make sure we're all on the same page. That we've had COVID-related and other kind of mental health and psychosocial problems sort of accelerating around the world in most countries. Some are doing a little better now, et cetera. But now to that, we must add the accelerating climate impacts. And this is difficult if you don't know this information, difficult to hear. Many of you already know it, but there is now almost a zero chance to prevent global temperatures from overshooting the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold that scientists believe will activate relentlessly harmful and likely irreversible impacts. My institute did the first climate modeling for the state of Oregon many years ago. And we first, our projections back then, this is almost 20 years ago, said, oh, this will happen at the end of the century. Then it was mid-century. And now, because of our failure to address the problem, there's a 50-50 chance that we're going to overshoot the 1.5 Celsius temperature threshold in the next 5 years. And if it doesn't happen, then it might happen within 5, 9 or 10 years, something like that. So this is imminent, but it's not just about climate issues per se. Under the current emission path, and we haven't seen any changes, actually it's still going up a bit, we're going to see collapses of ecosystems and catastrophic biodiversity loss this decade in the tropical oceans that then moves northward. So the reality is we are going to overshoot that 1.5 degree Celsius temperature threshold that's very dangerous. And we are actually, in a technical way to look at this, in the midst of a climate ecosystem biodiversity mega emergency. It's not just about greenhouse gas emissions. That is already and will increasingly alter every aspect of society. And we just have to get our heads around this. We're in the midst of a civilization altering event. And if we remain unprepared, individual, community, and societal traumas are going to occur at a scale we've never seen before in modern society. We're going to enter the new era that I call the trauma scene. You know, we know that we call this new geological era we're in, the Anthropocene, where humans affect what we do, affects what happens. But coupled with that will be the trauma scene, where there's just constant ongoing traumas. The most pervasive impacts and are not the disasters that we see happening. They're cascading disruptions to the ecological, social, and economic systems we all rely on for food, water, shelter, jobs, incomes, health, safety, and other basic needs that create toxic stresses that affect everyone. Just an example here in the west coast of the US where I live, there's been a long-term drought in California that has depressed food supplies, that has raised the cost of food for people all over the US. And also here, in that's a toxic stress. So there's no disaster, sort of acute disaster. In another example, again, out where I live, we've had many wildfires because of the drought that's occurred. And the wildfires are now creating smoke events that last a month or 2 months, where everyone lives with constant dangerous smoke. And so it's just constantly stressful. Sometimes you're not even supposed to go outside if you want to remain healthy. And intermixed with those pervasive toxic stresses, and by toxic we mean persistent and overwhelming stresses, are more frequent, extreme, and prolonged disasters that can traumatize millions of people. The people, about up 20 to 40% of the people who are directly impacted by the disaster can experience mental health problems, as can people who view the disaster from afar or even know someone who is impacted. And the disasters can include floods, wildfires, big storms and other sorts of events. And left unaddressed, the result of the combination of these cascading disruptions to the core systems we all rely on and those disasters is already creating and will increasingly create a global pandemic of individual, community, and societal distresses and traumas. What do we mean by that? Many of us understand what the psychological, emotional, and spiritual distresses are, but I'll just sort of read it. It's an understandable and normal response associated with stressors or demands that are difficult to cope with, or that result from witnessing harmful situations, or that result from fantasizing about them. So eco-anxiety, as it's often been called, sort of falls into that category, where people are just nervous about what the future brings. But many people are already experiencing, and we will see increasingly more, individual trauma, psychological, emotional trauma. And a way to define that is a blow to the psyche that breaks through one's defenses with such brute force and speed that one cannot react to it effectively. And as so often happens in catastrophes, people withdraw into themselves. They feel numb, vulnerable, and very alone. And that often leads to mental health problems, severe anxiety, depression, PTSD, complicated grief, but it also leads to psychosocial problems, meaning people do things that because of their own mental health condition that affect others. So it becomes a psychosocial. So they drink too much alcohol, they get addicted to drugs, or they become aggressive and violent with others. But in addition to that, what we're already seeing and will increasingly see are community and societal traumas. And these aren't sort of as well known as individual trauma. So community trauma can be defined as an event or series of events that create a blow to the basic tissue of social life that damages the bonds that attach people together and impairs their prevailing sense of community. It is the gradual realization that the community no longer exists as an effective source of support, and that an important part of the self has disappeared. So community trauma takes place in a specific geographic area, the neighborhood, a community, but it also can affect people with shared identities like religious or spiritual or refugee groups or internet-based groups. A good example, again, out where I live in the Pacific Northwest of Oregon, the wildfires have burned down entire towns recently, and that creates community trauma. And societal trauma goes beyond a specific geographic area or group with a shared identity to affect entire cultures, entire nations, or all of humanity. The COVID pandemic is a classic example. Everyone around the world has been affected. And the global climate emergency is also a societal trauma. And what's important to realize, we've mostly in the mental health field, and I think this is the case in Scotland also, we've looked at mental health issues as an individual problem, and therefore mostly individual solutions, clinical treatments, and other kinds of interventions and supports are helpful. But in fact, these individual, community, and societal traumas feed on themselves. And that's because trauma becomes buried in our nervous system. We can get into what that's about later, but and what this means is people end up when they're traumatized, denying what's happening, dissociated from it, disconnecting from reality, blaming others, attacking others, self-sabotaging, and reenacting the same behaviors that caused the problems in the first place because they're trying to work them out somehow, or they're denying or dissociating that it happened, and so you just get this vicious cycle that of distorted perceptions and facts and truths, harmful social norms, institutions, we versus them, tribalism, all sorts of intensified racism and other kinds of problems, inequities. And the combination of these individual, community, and societal traumas, if they're not addressed, can simply unravel families, groups, communities, and entire societies. And we are already seeing that in many parts of the world. And the other thing to realize is the traumas and climate solutions are directly linked. Unaddressed pervasive trauma is going to make it very hard to reduce the climate emergency to manageable levels. So it's not just about mental health it's also about our ability to address the climate emergency. And that's because traumatized people, as you heard before, tend to withdraw into a self-protective survival mode. They're trying to protect themselves to stay alive. And that prevents them from grasping or meaningfully addressing complex problems like the climate emergency. And I think we're seeing that again in many, many locations. An important point to make is that climate traumas and most other mental health problems result from interactions between individual, family, social, economic, physical built, and ecological factors. The mental health world that I was trained in and practiced in for many years really is sort of focused on the belief that mental health issues are really an individual psychobiological problem or a family problem, but in fact, they're caused by much more than that. In the social ecological model, you can look that up. Lots of research on it really describes this much better. But our mental health, human services, and disaster management systems don't address these multiple factors. They mostly react to crisis and illness. They're reactive systems that focus on crisis and illness. They can't address today's scale and scope of mental health problems. Certainly in the US, for example, only about 15 to 20% of the people who experience a mental health or a psychosocial problem can get assistance from the mental health system. And they have no chance of preventing or healing the scope and scale of the problems speeding our way. It's just not a system, the way we've approached it, that can deal with it. It will remain very important, but it's not the system. We must therefore think systemically and respond holistically and create innovations in community engagement and support. That's the only way we're going to deal with these. But what we have seen in the work we do, my organization does, is that we take this path, the climate mega emergency, become our greatest teacher. We learn a tremendous about what's needed to create well-being, a tremendous amount about what kind of economic systems we really need. So we must build population capacity for what we call transformational resilience. And what we mean by that is when suffering is caused by previously unseen external forces that have no endpoint, no resolution, or simple cure, that's what's happening with the climate emergency. The priority must be to help people develop the capacity to buffer themselves and push back against those stressors. And in doing that, find constructive new sources of meaning, purpose, and healthy hope. That's very different than treating deficits or treating symptoms of pathology, trying to fix deficits. So what we mean by transformational resilience is helping everyone to develop capacity for what we call presencing or self-regulation and co-regulation. And that is calming the body, mind, emotions, and behaviors in the midst of adversities, and purposing. And that means adversity-based growth. That is to help people find new sources of meaning, purpose, and healthy hope in life. So presencing and purposing. How do we want to live our lives? How do we want to organize our communities? How do we want to organize our economies in the midst of these ongoing adversities that are only going to accelerate for decades to come due to the climate emergency? And the combination of presencing and purposes we've seen in all the work we do, and I think if you think about it in your own life, you'll find it, you probably don't use those terms, but you'll find it the same way. It's what really can rebuild hope in the future. The capacity for transformational resilience is also shaped by interacting individual, family, social, economic, physical, built, and ecological conditions. We've got to address all of those factors, not just an individual's or family dynamics, although they will remain very, very important. And addressing these multi-systemic factors requires what is called a public health approach to mental wellness and resilience, not a clinical approach, not an individualized clinical approach. A public health approach to mental wellness and resilience takes a population level approach, not one that merely focuses on individuals with symptoms of pathology or high-risk groups, although they must be given special attention. It's sort of like a vaccine. When you have a disease that's flowing around like COVID, you don't want to just give a vaccine to a few people. You want everyone to be vaccinated, because even if people who are not vaccinated will affect those who are vaccinated. So it's got to be population based, and our mantra has got to be leave no one behind. A public health approach to mental wellness and resilience prioritizes preventing problems before they occur, not merely reacting to or treating them after they emerge. So our focus must be on prevention first. And we're not that good at that in this field, the mental health field. And in any field, humans are struggle with this issue, prevention. But we know how to do it, and I'll explain that in a second. And to prevent, it focuses on strengthening protective factors, social norms, social supports, individuals and collective skills, resources, policies that shift unhealthy thinking, habits, and behaviors to healthy, just, and sustainable thinking behaviors. Again, not just fixing deficits or treating symptoms of pathology. So our emphasis must be on building strengths and resources. Leave no one behind, prevention first, build strengths and resources. And the research shows that this approach can work. We can prevent mental health and psychosocial problems, and mental wellness and resilience can be enhanced. And research also shows, and Fiona suggested, we kicked off a 2-year research project with a team of 22 people that spent a lot of time looking all over the world at these issues. And this is what we found, is that the research shows the most effective way to address widespread mental health and psychosocial spiritual problems. And by spiritual, I mean hopelessness is a huge part of the climate traumas, and it's loss of spirit. So it's psychosocial, but it's psychosocial spiritual. It means to establish the social infrastructure in communities, what we call a resilience coordinating coalition, or RCC, but there's lots of these around. They call it whatever they want, whatever resonates locally, the term, that engages a wide and diverse array of grassroots and neighborhood leaders, nonprofit, public, and private organizations. They bring them together into a coalition or a network, and they jointly plan, implement, and continually improve actions that build and sustain the capacity for mental wellness, resilience, transformation, resilience among all adults and youth in their neighborhood or in their community. So here's an example of how these groups come together. Resilience coordinating coalitions. You could call it well-coordinated decentralization, if you will. It's a ring team or a hub and spoke approach. So inside this circle, the inner circle, you see neighborhood leaders, private sector, civic leaders, youth leaders, public sector, nonprofit, et cetera. They've come together and they form a steering committee or a board, whatever you want to call it. And they're sort of taking responsibility for identifying the strategies and implementing them that can build population level mental wellness resilience. They might select a chair, co-chairs, and executive committee to make decisions on a daily basis. But outside of that, there's a whole bunch of what we call resilience teams, resilience innovation teams. So there's groups that are just working with neighborhood groups. On the upper right hand, there's some that are working with the private sector, some working with youth innovation teams, some working at the educational systems, and you can see this around. They're doing their own thing, but they come back and they stay carefully coordinated with everyone else by sharing what they're doing through the steering committee. They identify gaps. Is there populations that are not being served, or overlaps? Oh, we're both doing the same thing in that neighborhood. That's interesting. They sort of coordinate fundraising together. Maybe they go together. They find out that the same entities are going to the same funders. Oh, let's develop one strategy, one proposal together, or let's make it very clear that these are two different proposals so they can both get funded. It's a well-coordinated decentralization. And our research has found that there's 5 foundational areas that are just vital for these community coalitions, the neighborhood coalitions, to focus on to build population capacity for mental wellness and resilience for the climate emergency. This is specifically for the climate emergency, but we have found that it applies to many other kinds of issues. The first and most important is to build social connections across cultural, economic, and geographic boundaries in the community. Get people connected. And in so many communities around the world, this kind of social connections has really dissipated for a lot of reasons. But there's some really exciting programs and initiatives around that we've identified, some in Canada, some other places, that are really specifically trying to bring people together to develop connections. And they're called bonding, bridging, and linking social support networks, which we can get in if we had enough time. Equally important as you develop these social connections between people, let me back up and say that the social connections are important because good social connections are vital for mental health and well-being. They're a core element of it, but they're also vital for any kind of disasters and emergencies. That in most disasters and emergency, it's your neighbors and friends who help you out, often for the first 3 to 5 days, not disaster management professionals. They come in afterwards because it takes some time to get organized. So it's really important. But just as important is to make a just transition by engaging residents, actively engaging residents, creating healthy and equitable, climate resilient, physical built, economic and ecological conditions. Physical built means housing, transportation systems, et cetera. Local systems, economic systems are locally owned and operated businesses and providing living wage jobs. Ecological systems involve healthy local forest ecological systems. In many communities around the world, that's a job of government now or the private sector. But what we have found is how those issues are addressed in those sectors directly affects the health and well-being and mental wellness of the people living there. They need to be actively involved in planning and implementing those actions. And there's many programs around the world that are doing that. And a just transition means, again, leave no one behind. The impacts of the climate emergency and the benefits of addressing it have to be spread equally among all populations. The third component is to build universal literacy about mental wellness and resilience. This is connected to health literacy. It's helping everyone understand how trauma and toxic stress can affect their mind, body, emotions, and behaviors. That's called becoming trauma informed. And then learning these self-regulation or presencing and purposing or adversity-based growth skills. Everybody should learn these skills. Just like everybody now pretty much learns to read and write, everybody should now develop literacy about mental wellness and resilience. The fourth focus is to help residents regularly engage in specific practices that enhance mental wellness and transformational resilience. The research clearly shows this. As the climate emergency worsens, we're going to have to find ways to keep laughing, find something joyful in life, practice forgiveness for other people who do things because they're stressed out that harm us, and for ourselves, self-forgiveness, because we're going to do things that might harm others because we're stressed. We got to keep learning. We got to be grateful, care for the body. And again, we can dive into the specifics of this. And finally, we need to establish age and ongoing culturally appropriate opportunities for residents to heal their traumas. This means organizing healing circles or other group methods in communities that people can go to: somatic healing, expressive therapies, mindfulness-based healing, spiritual healing, nature-based or animal therapies, lots of memorial events. You'll notice back on the lower right that clinical treatment will remain important, but it's just really a small component of what's really needed to heal trauma. Many people who engage in the other four elements I talked about, foundational areas, will heal themselves when they're traumatized. But many people will still be traumatized as the climate emergency worsens, especially as we get above the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold, which is coming at us like a freight train. So we need to establish all these methods, but clinical treatment will remain very important for people who still cannot function or are at risk of harming themselves or harming others. Just a few examples of resilience coordinating coalitions in the US. There's the Climate Resilience Initiative in Walla Walla, New Hanover County Resiliency Task Force in North Carolina, Putnam County Community Resilience Coalition in New York that focused on children. San Francisco Neighborhood Empowerment Program, one of the best that's bringing people together to build those social support networks. The Mobilizing Action for Resilient Communities, MARC, which is run by the Health Federation of Philadelphia, has a report you can get, has over 200 of these kind of associations, mostly focused on adverse childhood experiences. Only a few of the initiative frame their work as a public health program, but they're using a public health approach. Each is unique and none addresses all 5 of the core foundational areas. Only a few are explicitly focused on the climate emergency yet, but if they expand their focus to directly address the climate crisis, and thousands of new initiatives community-based initiatives are formed around the world, we can build universal transformational resilience. And to do that, we need many communities of practices to educate, empower, and connect practitioners in the field. We're running one right now. Fiona was involved with some of the planning for it. But we need them in all sorts of nations, provinces, and local levels. So I encourage you to think about how to form your own communities of practices. And we also need new policies to support this work. And in October of this year, after 2 years of work, my organization got the Community Mental Wellness and Resilience Act introduced in the US Congress by Representative Paul Tonko and Brian Fitzpatrick. It's bipartisan, which is unusual in the US. We have support by 115 organizations around the US, including the American Psychological Association, the Psychiatric Association, National Association of Social Workers, on and on. So it's a really broad-based group, and I think there's a chance we'll move this bill in the next Congress. But we need similar policies. This funds and supports these community-based initiatives. And other nations, Scotland, UK, many other nations should look at the possibility of doing something similar, as well as state, provincial, and local levels. So I'm going to end there and to say that more information can be found on our website. I published a book about these issues called Transformational Resilience back in 2016. I have a new one coming out, it's supposed to be out in January, but it won't be out until March now, that specifically talks about the community-based initiatives, the community-based element of this. So I thank you for listening. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Fiona.
Hello, can you hear me okay? Sorry, I had trouble unmuting there. I think I'd been put on mute by someone. Anyway, thank you very much for that, Bob. I mean, that was a massive different things for us to start kind of trying to consider in terms of your experience of all the different kind of foundational elements you put in place to think about how we deal with the kind of crises that, as you say, are absolutely charging our way. But it was striking me as you were talking about a lot of the foundational elements. This is, for the most part, is, people here from the community-led sector, and the community-led sector is in that primary position to deal with some of those foundational elements, perhaps not the whole structural, sort of systemic kind of approach to this, but certainly in terms of dealing with people where they are, where they live in real time, but also being able to collectively come together to try and influence those policies and, and that, bit of legislation, which is of big interest to us here in Scotland. I mean, we've got a Community Empowerment Act, but we don't have a Resilience Act or anything. So from that point of view, there's maybe something for us to learn from there. I'd like to open up for questions now. I mean, I think basically if people could just use the hand function, and I'll scroll through the screen just to see who I can see with their hands up. But if people could also maybe use the chat, that would be helpful. And as I say, we won't get to everybody, but if you've got questions for Bob, either do both and we'll try and respond as much as we can. And also facilitators and folk from Scan and SCA, if you see somebody's got their hand up, fire me a direct message so that I can bring them in. So can I open it up now for anybody who would like to ask Bob a question? Chris Boddington, would you like to ask Bob something?
Hi Bob, hi. That was amazing. So yeah, messaging about the climate crisis, emergency. So do you think it's really important to say right out at the beginning, like you did with us, like it's happening. There's little chance that we're meeting 1.5 degrees C, because, you know, I've got a fear when I'm in touch with so many people in the community, and I'm saying this straight out, that right from then they're going to shut down and won't connect because of the fear. So I'm trying to look into other messaging, like how do you know, part of me thinks, no, you need to know. You got to say the fact and then you go from there. But what do you think about maybe just going for a wholly positive approach and, you know, talking about just transition as a wonderful opportunity? But do you feel like we have to give these stark facts?
Well, thank you. Very good question. I think the answer is you have to start where people are at. I start with, you know, the reality of the climate emergency with this kind of group right away, because I think you need to know, and I think you're in the field, so to speak. But I think the more you can learn a little bit or understand where the people you're working with are at, and start with something they care about, and connect it to that. You know, so if it's jobs or their kids, et cetera, just, you know, just somehow talk about what are your kids doing? How do you see them engaging in these kind of issues? So start where people are at, that you can address it. And I often don't use the term climate change when I talk with the general public. Out in the US, we talk about extreme weather events. Well, the cause of those extreme weather events is irrelevant. People are experiencing them and they get it. They say, well, let's figure out a way to prepare more for those. Or in some communities that we work in, we just talk about kitchen top table issues, jobs, food, etc. And boy, we're seeing food prices go up because of the drought in California, because that's been public. How do we prepare ourselves for that? Is that stressful to you? How do we prepare ourselves for that? So again, try to figure out what the people are most concerned about, what their focus is, and start from there and just see if you can expand the conversation without getting into climate science and all that, you know, unless you're talking to, you know, somebody who's willing to do that.
Okay, thanks. There's a question in the chat, Bob, from Caris. Is that how you pronounce your name, Caris? Someone who works with young people and they're interested in eco-anxiety, and asking if you've got any thoughts on how teachers can reasonably increase mental resilience in their classrooms.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Eco-anxiety is common. My wife and I feel it. We used to love the fall and the late summer here in Oregon, but now because of the drought, which will go on now, it looks like for the rest of this decade, the fire season makes it extremely risky. So now we fear that time of year. And that's sort of an example of eco-anxiety. But the best way our research and our experience has been, especially with youth, first of all, bring them together with others, focus on those social connections, and engage them in pro-social activities. So have them, you might want to think about engaging them in planting trees in the community, or in other ways helping others and help them feel like they're doing something to make things better as they develop those social connections. But also in age appropriate ways, you might consider teaching them that you know, to become trauma informed, to use the buzzword. You know, when you feel all stressed out, do you know what's happening within? Well, actually, it's something that's very natural. It's instinctual. Your body's reacting to a sense of fear, and so now you're getting stressed. That's actually how it all works for all humans. It's nothing wrong with you, nothing unusual. And here's how we know you can deal with that. So teach some very simple self-regulation skills. It might be breathing. Breath skills, or it might be getting outside and connecting with nature. But so all those 5 kind of components that I talked about, those foundational areas, can be integrated into an approach for youth that really brings them together. The Mycelium Youth Network in Oakland, California, is one of the leaders in this that I've seen in the US. You might want to look them up. And they engage youth specifically because of the climate emergency, engage youth in activities where they meet new people, engage in activities like planting trees and improving, doing recycling and making things better. And when they see even small signs of progress, their sense of hope increases. And that's really important. You want them to be able to visually see small signs of progress, and it increases their sense of hope. And again, also focuses on that collective efficacy, not just alone. So move this beyond just an individual issue to a collective sense.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Anybody else got a question or a point they'd like to raise? I'm looking around here to see if I can see any hands up. David Barber from Scottish Community Safety Network, is that right? You've just shared the resource. Do you want to just give us a couple of words on it? Are people able to unmute? Joanna?
I wasn't there. I had to have you do it.
Oh, did you? Right, okay.
Or somebody else. I don't know who did it. Yeah, no, I just was sharing a resource there that just as you were kind of talking about there, Bob. Last year we did a bit of, started to become aware 20 years too late that or longer that the climate crisis might impact on areas of community safety policy and interest. And so things like yeah, even simple stuff like road safety, rail safety, water safety, coasts, erosion. It turned out quite a lot of things, quite a lot of areas of community safety. And you've just mentioned some more there that we are looking to look at in the future around sort of substance use, traumatic events, crime. We're also aware there was some research done published last year, early this year, that had said that the suicide rate in North America is projected to increase significantly as a consequence of the climate crisis. So looking at those kind of things, we didn't cover that more social side of it, but certainly the sort of practical, how is the climate crisis going to affect infrastructure? How is it going to affect safety in communities? And that we've developed this zine. So if people want to have a little look at it, I'd encourage you to take a look. You can download it from our website.
That's really helpful. Thanks very much, David. I see there's something in the chat here from Susie Lilly asking if we can connect with some of the community-led organisations and projects in the States, Bob. Would they be open to that?
Yeah, many of them are part of our coalition now. So email me at the trig-cli.org, and we can connect you with those, or you can become part of a community practice, etc. We have people, our community practice that we're now running, it's halfway done. We have people from Germany, some from Scotland, and we had a couple of people from Africa and other places in addition to the US, and many from Canada. So it's an international group, and we want more and more people to get engaged.